ストへようこそ。 MC の大西レオです。今日は名古屋ダイヤモンドドルフィンズのヘッドコーチショーン・デニスさんに来ていただきました。できるだけ喋ってもらいたいのと、母国オーストラリアの方たちにも、ぜひ聞いてもらいたいと思いまして、今回はインタビュー英語で行いたいと思います。Alright, so welcome to the Dolphins Podcast, official podcast of the Nagoya Diamond Dolphins, coached by the great Shawn Dennis, who's right in front of me.
You're too kind.
Thanks for coming to the show.
It's a pleasure. It's always great to come and share, experiences and give an insight to what we do.
I remember I asked you about doing a podcast before the season, and I've been tagging along throughout the season with you guys. You've welcomed me with open arms, which I'm very grateful. So thank you very much for that. So how has the season been going so far for you?
I think, one of the things I noticed with our group this year, right from the start, I remember about 2 weeks into pre-season and walking into our office and saying, gee, I think this group's going to be an amazing man-to-man defensive team. Perhaps we don't need as many of the changing defenses that we've used in the past. And so we as a group, we've reduced some of those things, and we really have thus far, I guess, and the analytics to say so as well, that we've developed into right now what's the best defensive team in the league. So that's really been the platform for our position.
Yeah, the best defense is, I think that there's much more to say than best defense. Like, you guys are like top-notch defense. The only defensive rating 90s is the Dolphins. So was that a surprise for you? Did you see this coming?
We definitely recruited to be better defensively, but I didn't think we'd be this good, and I can sit here confidently and say that because the defense has really gotten us out of trouble. We haven't been a great shooting team this year, but our defense has been able to bring us back into games, and there's no doubt we gain a lot of confidence through our defense. And probably the best example was the Ibaraki game, down by 20-something points, and to fly back into it, and it was all based off our defense. And from that, the confidence grew. And, a lot of people talk about the shots that Takumi made and Hugh and Aaron Henry, but really it was the defensive pressure and disruption that created the confidence in the group, and it just grew and grew. And I think that's been the success of what we are. And, to think we'd be able to do that, you dream about it, right. You have a vision for it, for the team, but to watch it unfold continuously has been a real joy and a pleasure as a coach, coaching for 30 years now. And I think this right now, still 16 games in the regular season, and then the CS, a long way to go, and it's going to get tested. But right now, this is easily the best defensive team I've ever coached.
Right. I think people have the image of Nagoya being an offensive team in the past years, but this year it's been very good defense, but the effective field goal rate is kind of down on Nagoya's side. But I think it's been on the rise lately, but obviously aiming for that championship, the playoffs. But do you see the team shifting towards that?
Well, we do. Since the bye week, we've worked really hard on our spacing and trying to be on the same page. And even in the game when we won against FE by 4 points, and we went 7 of 38 from the 3-point line, when I looked at the film and, we missed 31 threes, and I thought 2 were bad shot selection. All right. And that's going to happen. I thought 7 were shots where you go, well, they're prepared to let you shoot that and see what happens. But I thought 22 of the shots were very good shots by the right people, and we just didn't make them. And so you want to stay positive on that. And I think that's where your offensive rebounding is so important, which is another area we're very strong at, and to keep giving those guys confidence. And I thought, through the weeks of practice, it's been getting better, and you can see the confidence growing. And I thought against Koshigai, even I know that, standings-wise, they're not one of the better teams, but they're a dangerous team. I thought our shooting really started to gain a lot of confidence, and these last 2 weeks of practice have been much better shooting-wise. And I'd like to think it's starting to grow. The team's starting to really believe in itself, and they should. The team's done a terrific job. They have the equal best record in the league, and they should be confident in themselves, and I want them to be confident in themselves. And, as long as we say, you take a shot that we all expect you to take, then we've got our jobs to do, we'll go and do it. And I don't want anybody to hesitate, and I think that's important.
Right. So you mentioned about having the talent to have this kind of defensive system this year. Was the recruiting a joint effort between the new front staff and obviously Kaji-san as well?
Well, mostly it's Kaji-san and myself. Higashino-san coming in is obviously he suggested Jake, but Jake's young and still learning. But most of it was we'd already done. We always do it collectively and we talk about it. And we knew that in Aaron Henry we started recruiting him as soon as we could. So that was before Higashino-san came on board, because we knew we needed another playmaker. But I think the underestimated part of Aaron's game is his defense.
Yeah.
I know he leads the league in steals, and he's terrific anticipation off the ball, but he's actually a very good defender when he's focused and locked in. And he's proven that, and he loves taking on those challenges. And that was a big part of, for me, recruiting, because he's very versatile. He can defend a point guard, he can defend a power forward, and everybody in between. So and that's the great thing about this group is its versatility. And I think Isaiah Murphy's proven to be that. Take's defense on the ball has really improved. It's not just crazy out of control anymore. He's understanding about containment and disruption, and I think that's. And those guys who have been with us now for 2 years have really fit into that and understand what we're trying to achieve. And I think that's what's made it so good.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. The ability to switch all the defenses with Henry and Zay is really strong, I think.
Yeah. And even Keita and Taito, you put them in there, and, our guards are a reasonable size, and that's the good thing with Takuma Sato coming back into the team, and slowly increasing his time. It gives us another big wing, and I think we can even evolve our switching defense a bit more as we head towards the CS.
Yeah, we even have Scott guarding on the perimeter when there's a switch, right?
Exactly.
So he can move his feet, actually.
He can.
Very good. Yeah. So, very, very excited for this season. Looking forward to many good things. I kind of want to take a step back and kind of dig into what kind of coach you are as a person. So how would you describe yourself as a coach in your own words?
Passionate, demanding, and caring would be the way to do it. And I think, the fans see the passionate guy on the sideline at times, although I think I'm much calmer these days. The demanding coach that demands a high standard from the players and everybody, and as much of myself as anybody. But then a caring coach, I care about every one of the players and staff, and I want them to, enjoy what we do. I think we're very lucky and privileged to get to do what we do. I mean, it's not easy. It's not for everybody, but it really is a privilege to do it. So, to care about them and make sure that those with families are getting enough family time, and, we do things like, I'll move a practice, for example, if someone's kid's got, an event on at school, and I don't want any of my players or staff to ever miss those things. If I have one regret in my coaching life is I missed a lot of those things with my kids growing up.
Right.
And I regret that. That's the only regret I have in my coaching career is the things that I missed with my kids. And I think that's important for all the players. If they have something on with their family that's a once-off type thing, then I want them to go and enjoy that and making sure that they're all okay at all times. And I think the hardest part is for the players and fans and everyone who see that passionate, demanding guy and they think I'm angry, particularly, in Japan, because it's not a normal thing, whereas back home it's so different, that it takes some players a while to realise just how much I do care, because I think, I live by the fact that I think most human beings don't know how good they can be. They don't know what their limits are. So, and most people don't ever get to that to find out. And so unfortunately, they probably never reach their potential. And I heard a great saying one day that said, there's no such thing as a good or bad player. There's just those who reach their potential and those who don't. And I think most people don't realise how much more they can give, how much more they can find. And so you've got to push people out of their comfort zone, and you've got to demand that they do that so they can grow, they can learn. And sometimes that can be misconstrued as angry, as, not caring, but it's actually the opposite. And, I've had many players, some who have left and gone away, and then it clicks and goes, oh gosh, coach actually was doing this for me. Wow, that was amazing. And they come back, and then there's players that stay with me who, once they realise that, they just blossom into, the players that I think they have the potential to become, and I think that's what we're seeing a little bit of this year, is some of these guys start to really blossom into what they can become. And when they do that as individuals, the team benefits, the fans benefit, our sponsors benefit, the club benefits, everybody benefits from that. But you've got to be willing to push.
Right. And
that sometimes as a coach is difficult, because you've got to upset people. Right, I guess is the easiest way to put it, but I'll never change that, because I think that's one of my strengths as a coach, is that I'm going to push you out of your comfort zone, and you're going to find out some things about yourself, and you're going to have that opportunity. And my whole thing is to try and create an environment for growth. And so I'm going to do whatever it takes to do that. And, I take time to try and understand a person's personality, and they mightn't realise that at times, but I'm watching how they learn, what, I guess we say, what buttons I need to push. And some need you to be angry, some need you to be more caring, some need real pushing, some need, a softer approach. And once you learn those things, I think you can really help people grow.
It's always funny when you go on social media and you see worrying fans of when watching you and Aaron barking at each other during games. I just take it as, no, that's just basketball talk. But
yeah, well, I think I'd much rather a player bark back at me, because if he barks at me, then he cares. He's caring about what's going on, and that's important, and vice versa. And sometimes I'll say to a player, if I stop talking to you, then there's a good chance I've given up. So you don't want that, righto, because that's important. And and I think we're watching Aaron evolve into a much better player than he was, and I think he's also evolving as a person, as a teammate, which was important, and I watch him now, and he's in the last month, I think he's really started to become more of a very good teammate, and wanting to be part of the team. And I think, to me, we've talked a lot about it, that was important for him to help us to achieve our vision. He had to do that. And I was going to push him to do that. And, and I think we've now come to, you probably won't see us bark at each other anymore, because I think we've now come to an understanding of how it works.
Right.
And sometimes you've got to go through those moments to find that out. And that's what I talk about, as you said, fans are like, oh God, do they just, no, we don't dislike each other. We both want to win. We both want to be the best we can be, and so we're going to push our buttons until we work out how we can best make the relationship work.
Right.
And and I think right now it's at a really good place, and I think with the whole team it's in a really good place. And I think I'd like to believe in the coming month you're going to see this team really, really blossom and get ready for the CES.
Yeah, I already feel that coming too. So I remember I just talked to the youth guys the other day for this podcast. The young guys that came up from the youth team, and they mentioned how Aaron really talks to them and converses with them and helps them out, gives them advices. And that was very surprising to me, knowing him from day one. So that was a surprising moment for me. Yeah.
He's actually a terrific person. Deep down he's got a heart of gold, and I think people don't see that because he's a competitor. Right. And for him, it's evolving emotionally and not getting caught up with things out of his control. And that's been the biggest thing, we're trying to do, and his teammates are really starting to do, and he's starting to grow into that. And one of the things I saw him say when he talked about our next play mentality, and he said that was something he was really starting to try and buy into. But I watch him all the time with the young guys, so asking questions. Do they know how to do this? No. Okay, well, this might help you. And, he does it with the 2 youth guys. He does it with Hugh. He does it with Take. It's really fun to watch him do that. And you know that when you see a kid doing that he cares.
Right.
And sometimes that persona is to me, it's really a facade. Underneath that is a really special guy.
Right.
And, he's becoming more fun to work with as he said, as we get to know each other and his teammates get to know him and he gets to trust his teammates a bit more and trust the coaching staff. It's a terrific relationship.
Yeah. When you see things like that, you that's when you realize what a good team it is.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess you really take pride in helping players reach that potential, or maybe even going over that potential. Who are some players that you've seen throughout your career that reached and maybe went over their potential?
If we talk about Japan, so most of the listeners know, I thought Sakamoto reached his potential as one. I think Takumi's really blossomed. I think he had a good foundation before he played under me. And then all I did was really let him loose and encourage him to make decisions, and to watch him go the way he has been terrific. I'm watching Isaiah Murphy really start to blossom into a good player, and I think in another 12 months to 18 months, I think he'll become a very consistent shooter, and I think he's getting a better understanding of what he's capable of.
Right.
And he's doing the work to make it happen. So I think he's been fun to watch. I think Scott Etherton's. Scott was really good before he arrived, but I think he's become a more knowledgeable player, and
right.
His relationship with Takumi is amazing.
Yes.
And I think the best in the league, 1-2 punch, and teams do a lot to try and stop it, which opens up for other people. I think Ray Parks, when he first arrived, he learnt in his time at the Dolphins about professionalism, being in physical shape, playing both sides of the ball, and I think he evolved into a really special player. And that was a little. My relationship with him was a little like Aaron's early on, but in the end, I think he really understood where it was all coming from. It was actually coming from a good place. I thought watching Suda's leadership evolve in his time at the Dolphins. Was really fun, and so it was a different aspect to watch. It was part of what we were trying to do when he came here, and that was to help him become a better leader. And I think he evolved into a terrific leader. And a lot of work went into that. And I think Naga Higashi is a much more consistent player. And sometimes it's not necessarily guys becoming special. It's getting an understanding of what it takes to win, to be a professional player, and Takuma Sato, went through a lot of things early in his career, and being there for him as a father figure was fun, and then to watch him go on and win a championship at Chiba and be on the cusp of the national team was pretty special, and hopefully we get to share that championship here. That would be my ultimate dream, to share that with a lot of these guys.
You kind of explained your who you are as a coach a few questions back. Is this something that evolved into it? You evolved into it? Looking back, obviously you have a 30-year career, so...
Well, my belief is I think it takes 20 years to master coaching, because there's just so much to learn. And, as a younger coach, I was volatile, and again, it came from a good spot, but I look back on that and think it wasn't healthy. And I've always felt I wanted to be a coach even when I was a teenager. I was always coach younger kids, and when I was playing underage, like under 18s, I would coach the under 14s and things like that. And then when I did become a pro, I was always going to junior camps and being part of that. And I just loved the part of coaching of learning how to beat people. Like how can... And when you watch a good team play, what can I do to try and beat that? and particularly if you don't have the talent. And in my coaching career, I've been lucky enough to coach some good teams, and I've also coached some pretty average teams. But I feel that no matter where I've coached, the teams that I've coached have always competed. And, even when I was at Shiga, we did a great job, and by year 3 we were above 500 and really playing well before COVID hit. And I thought we were a real chance to sneak into that bottom of the CS that year. But then we lost 7 players. Right. We lost 3 players to Nagoya, 2 to Mikawa, 1 to Chiba, and they didn't have the money to keep the other 2 Americans. So, all of a sudden you're starting again. And our budget was completely shut down. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden we couldn't afford anybody. And my 4th year in Shiga was one of the most enjoyable. We're spending, I think, 8 times less than Tokyo on our team. Right. But we won 23 games, and we beat a lot of teams spending more money than us. And we had what people would deem upset wins against some of the best teams. And that was one of the best years of my coaching. We found ways to compete and win, and I think because of that, it's probably how I ended up in Nagoya. And I look back at my last year in Australia, same thing. It was a club that was nearly going bankrupt every year, right. and we were losing players, and we just had a very young team, of which Nick Kay, who plays for Shimane, was part of that as a rookie, But that final year, we only won 11 games, but everyone predicted we'd be lucky to win 3 or 4, and we beat the championship team 3 out of 4 times. We found ways to win games, and we were in a lot of close games, but we were young. And the team had great potential, and it was just so much fun working with those young kids. But unfortunately, after that year, the club finally did go bankrupt, and we had to shut down. And that's how I ended up in Japan. So, right. But they're the fun times, And when you coach the lower teams, it's finding ways to compete. And when you coach the better teams like the Dolphins, it's a different thing you got to find and deal with.
Right.
A lot of people often say, "Oh, but he's got the best team; he should just win." It's not that simple. I mean, we've got to manage. Every one of our players thinks they can play 30 minutes, but some have got to miss out. So you've got to manage all these sorts of different things, and that's fun in itself. And then you've got a number of guys who want to shoot the ball and are probably talented enough to shoot the ball, but you can't all shoot the ball. So you've got to manage those things and find ways to get them to share it and share the fun and celebrate, with the Dolphins. And one thing I love about this group is the way they celebrate each other's success. Yeah, and the Ibaraki game is classic for that. A couple of guys sat who would normally be playing in that 4th quarter, and I threw Hugh in there, and I threw the 2 guards in there, and you watch the film afterwards, and our bench is as excited as the guys on the floor. And to me, when you see that, it makes your team pretty special, and that's what gives me great hope for this year's group.
Have you learned anything new about yourself this season?
A lot, actually, a lot. I think the biggest change in me this year has been not to be as probably confronting, to do it in a softer manner, like trusting the players a bit more and encouraging them rather than telling them. And I think that's been, and the player that's probably helped me the most with that has been Aaron. As the fans saw us going at each other, and for me realising that that's not the way to approach it with him, because every time you do that, we're just going to bump heads, and that's no good for anybody. And so having to find a better way to do that, and the same with some of our younger players, they don't deal well with, I guess, older style coaching, and trying to evolve myself as a person who doesn't do that anymore. It doesn't mean I won't occasionally, and there was a time in the last Koshigaya game where I got quite passionate,
right?
Mostly because we decided to defend an action in a particular way, and it didn't happen, and that was decided as a group. Mm-hmm. And as I said to the group afterwards, we decided this as a group. It didn't come from me. We made this decision. So when you don't do that, I'm going to come at you hard, and I'm going to demand you get it right. because we decided that. It's not me telling you to do that.
Right.
It was a group decision, and we've got to be great at those moments. And so that's, I think, been the biggest growth for me and the most enjoyable. And I think because of that, I'm actually really starting to enjoy my coaching again, at a much better level. Because playing 60 games a year is difficult. And, we're about to come into 14 games in 29 days. It's there is no rest, literally, and it's very wearing. And so, one of our catchphrases as a team, and mostly it came from me. I said, I want you guys to enjoy this. I want to enjoy this, so I'm going to do everything I can to make this more fun. And the feedback after the Ibaraki game, even though we were down by 23 or 4 points at one stage, the team said at no stage did I get angry. And I laughed a couple of them. I said, yeah, but I had to keep telling myself, stay calm, stay calm, stay calm. It's okay, you're going to be okay. And, because certainly the old Shawn would have probably had called a couple of timeouts and really ripped in. And I don't think that would have been very positive or very productive. And I think that growth is the side I'm proud of myself for the way I'm starting to grow in that way, that I'm finding a better way to get my message across.
Wow. 30 years of career, you're still growing as a coach.
Well, I've always said the day I stop growing and learning is the day I should step away from the game. And, and I think when you love something so much, you never stop learning. You never stop having a thirst for more knowledge of ways to do something better, of ways to improve what you do, to clarify what you do is the right way. And, that's what drives me. I love watching the game. I love watching different coaches and what they do. And I think coaching's, we plagiarize the most of anybody, coaches. It's rare you come up with your own idea. Often you've seen something and it sparks an idea in your head, and that's the fun part of the game.
So you mentioned that this year you're enjoying coaching as yourself again. Were there times in your career that you've been struggling with?
Absolutely. There's times when you question why you do it. You're battling away, and you cop a lot of criticism from different areas. There's an old saying, you can please some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but you can't please everybody all the time.
Right.
And you sometimes it's hard. The criticism. I mean, we're human beings. You try not to take any notice of social media or anything like that, but there's always critics out there. No matter how well you do, somebody doesn't like you. Somebody doesn't like what you do, and it's a tiring job. You don't get too much downtime. And particularly with our season going all the way through to the end of May, if you make the championship series, you literally get about 2 to 3 weeks, and then you're full on back into it again. You're constantly under enormous pressure to win, and sometimes you have jobs that the way it's resourced doesn't match the expectations.
Right.
And that's just crazy. I remember sitting in a meeting with a club one time, and we weren't very good, and they were promising to make the playoffs, to make the CS, and I said, that's ridiculous. You're setting us up to fail. And they said, well, what should we say? And I said, we're on a journey. We've got a young team. We spend the second least money. You don't have to say those things, but you say, we've got a young team. We want to grow. Come and help us grow. But they wanted to make the CS. And I see young coaches, particularly in Japan. I remember a few years ago, a young coach took on the Niigata job. And Niigata had finished second last the year before, hadn't really changed their team. And he promised the fans he'd make the CS. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. He got fired halfway through the season because he made a stupid promise that there is no way he was keeping. They were one of the bottom spending teams, and you just and I think I see that a lot, and that pressure gets to you at times, and finding ways to deal with that is the most. And I try and encourage young coaches all of my coaches to have, family time, you time, something that you can do to completely get away from the game, and for my wife, Lani, and I, ours is finding waterfalls. And I think a lot of our fans follow Lani's Instagram and see us out in nature. And, the crazy thing is on a lot of those trips to nature is when I come up with my best ideas because I'm at my most relaxed. And my mind's emptied and I'm feeling good. I know some of the guys love going to the onsens and that's where they relax and they often. So, but there's definitely times where you wonder why you do it. The outside pressures, the pressures internally, the disappointments. But then I sit back and say to myself, but what else would I do? I mean, my worst days at work are probably most people's best days at work. As I said, I'm lucky to do what I do. It's a privilege, and before every game at IG Arena, I walk in around about 3 hours before and just sit in the stadium. I've
noticed that every home.
And I just look around and really it's just to say, wow, here I am sitting in a 15, 16,000 seat stadium and I'm the head coach of this team. How lucky am I? It's just a way to keep me grounded, and I think that's really helped me find my joy for the game and bring it back to a level that it should be.
Is that a time that you kind of decided to do every home game? I've noticed that you sit there in that empty gym. So, not gym, I guess, empty arena.
Yeah, I did it the very first time we went in there just to take it all in. And it just gave me such an overwhelming feeling of satisfaction and joy, and one of the fun days was I think the cheer girls were out doing something and they called me and asked me to say a couple of words. And it was just beautiful, and I just thanked them for what they do, the way they get the crowd into it and how important they are to what we do. There's so many pieces that make this work on a game night. It's not just the team and the players who get most of the adulation. It's the fans, it's the cheer girls, the backroom staff that don't even get seen and all those things. And for me, it's important to acknowledge all those things. And sometimes just sitting there, that's just a reminder of all that goes into putting this together so that we can go out and perform and have a good time and hopefully give our fans something to be proud of. And for me, as I said, it just keeps you grounded. It doesn't let you get ahead of yourself. And I think that's the biggest killer in life, is when you start to get complacent and get ahead of yourself. And I just find it as a nice reminder that, this is a very privileged situation I'm in, and I want to make the most of it.
That's wonderful. So you coach both in Australia and Japan. What's been the biggest difference that you feel still with coaching back in Australia and here in Japan?
If we talk about the players, initially it was the skill levels quite different, and learning to adjust to that, but that's been growing because of the coach education has been terrific in Japan. In my this is my 10th year here, and watching the coaches grow. And obviously the influx of foreign coaches has brought in fresh ideas and ways to do things, and I think that's important. I think it's the hardest part for the Japanese coaches is because they don't really understand English. It's very difficult for them to learn outside of Japan. But that's being solved in a lot of different ways, and I think that's helped that knowledge to go back to the players. And the other biggest thing I've noticed is the pathways through to being a professional player are very different in Japan to Australia. I think Australia's development pathways are very highly rated on the world, and Spain and France and Canada and Germany. And I think Japan's not there yet. They still use the high school system. And I think it's got the potential to be good, but the problem is I think a lot of high school coaches have got to win to keep their jobs. Now, this is only my opinion. It may not be factual, but it's the same as the American system. It's very broken in terms of development, because if you don't win, you don't hold your job. So you place winning ahead of development at juniors. And And I think that's different in Australia. If you show potential, there's a lot of different ways to develop, a lot of very good pathways, while still playing the game as well. And, and I think that's a big difference on that side of it. And then the other thing I think is changing in Japan is the sharing among coaches. When I first arrived, very little sharing amongst coaches. The coaches were very closed to sharing information, and I think that's crazy. Mm-hmm. I mean, with today's technology, there's no secrets.
Right.
There's no secrets. I mean, you run a play, in a game, and if someone really wanted to, within 3 minutes, the whole world knows it. Who puts it up on Instagram or Twitter, and there's so many different platforms to show what you do, and then the scouting software compared to when I started now. When you broke down a game and cut up film when I started, it was 2 VCRs on top of each other. Right. It would take you 4 hours, 5 hours to do one game. Now you can bang it out in about 90 minutes, and you're ready to go and show the team. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand why, coaches don't share more. Because there is no secrets.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is changing as well. And as that changes, I think you'll find that the level of basketball will only keep rising.
So I've been a translator for coaching clinics that JBA does. Yeah. That they bring in international coaches, and that's like every year. I think that's like one of the first things that all the coaches say, that I'm here to share my knowledge with everybody.
Yeah. My ultimate thing is, and I say this to the team all the time, is I want to be unscoutable, right? Mm-hmm. So we do everything off read and react, and said, what I'd love to do is send my playbook to every coach in the league before the game and say, don't worry about watching film, here's the scout, good luck. That's my dream, mate. That's my utopian world where we're going to respond to whatever you do, so it doesn't matter.
Right.
And that's how we practice and try. And I think, over time, we've gotten pretty good at that. And even my Shiga teams who weren't as talented were pretty good at those things, and that's why we won games. And I go back to Townsville days, the same thing. I want the players to find themselves, to, what can I be good at? What's my point of difference? I think that's a big thing for young Japanese players to learn. Have a point of difference, but who's coaching them that? And as I was talking to Takuma Sato about, he spent his entire junior career as a big man, goes to college, he's playing a forward spot, but he was always going to be a wing. There was no development of that. Right. And that's a big difference too in Australia, Spain, Germany, France, Canada. You come through the junior program all pretty much doing the same thing and developing your skills. And by the time you get to 15 or 16, you maybe then start to splinter out into being a centre or a forward or whatever, and because you'll grow or whatever will happen, but the initial development's all the same. And so that's why you now see such an influx of Europeans, etc., in the NBA. Why? Because they're far more skilled overall than the Americans, but the Americans are far more athletic. So they get away with athleticism to be able to do it rather than skills. Whereas the Europeans who, Nikola Jokic is a classic example. He can hardly jump over a postage stamp. But his skill level and IQ is crazy.
Yeah, crazy. Off the charts.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference. And I think with the Japanese, sometimes the young Japanese players, they're encouraged to play out of control. There's no IQ to what they play to, and I often find that with some of the young players that get there, and they're encouraged to play out of control and play crazy. And you're like, that's not good basketball. And I think the players are learning that the coaches are learning that that's not good basketball, and so it's going up and up. And you look at what Tom Hovarth did with the national teams, both men and women. He taught them to play with that speed and pace, which is a point of difference for Japan basketball, but with control, with good decision making. And that's, I think, if the Japan players can learn that from a young age, we can become a very, very good nation at playing the game of basketball in our own way, because it suits us. You're not going to win the athletic game, you're not going to win the power game, but you can win the speed game, you can win the shooting game, you can win the decision-making game, and you can win the pressure game. And I think that's something we can see really evolve in the country.
All right. The organized chaos, right?
Yes, correct. Exactly what I love to call it.
Yes. So we've had an influx of a lot of Australian players and coaches following your footsteps, I would say, into the B League now. What are your feelings towards that?
I love it, obviously. Seeing my countrymen come into the country and help develop the game, I think it's fantastic, and it's something that's dear to my heart, because now I guess I'm like an import player, I'm an import coach, and I think we all have a responsibility to help grow the game. I mean, that's why we've been brought in. Obviously, people think that we can help the game in this country or they wouldn't bring us here. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that that's what we do. And something I'm very proud of that I've done is I've never had a foreign assistant coach at any time as a head coach. And I wish some of my colleagues didn't bring over 2-3 foreign coaches and were more prepared to bring in local coaches and help them grow, but that's their choice. But the great thing overall is the influx of players and coaches can only hopefully spread that knowledge and abilities. And the better players we bring in, the better coaches we bring in, then hopefully the better the players become. And I remember back home when in the 80s when I was just coming into play, I was 19, 20 years old, and a lot of teams had 4 or 5 Americans, and you had to find a way to compete or you wouldn't get any court time. And what it did for Australian basketball was it just grew and grew and grew and grew, along with some development pathways they started to do, etc. And I think that's what I love seeing, when my countrymen come over here and they start to lift the standards rather than, the most important thing is that no one ever goes down to a standard. You pull people up to the standard, and that's what I see happening. When I watch people come in.
Yeah, the local players needing to get court time is something we're going to face next year. And to me, they got to. It's you can say it's unfair, it's fair, however you want to do it. But the only way they can view it is, well, if I want to get court time, I've got to find a way to beat that guy. I've got to beat that guy out. And that's what happened in the late 80s and early 90s in Australia. The Australian players started to really compete and work hard and became better. And now in Australia, while teams can have 3 Americans, the Australian players are just as good. And I think the local players and people have got it. You're not going to change it right now. That's the way it's going to be. Then find a way to compete against that. Don't cry about it. Right.
Okay, what have I got to do to beat this guy? What's you look at our team right now. Okay, if you don't want me to play Aaron 30 minutes a game, then find a way to change my mind. Okay, that's up to you as an individual. Now, if you can't do that, of course I'm going to play him 30 minutes. So I think you've got to take the fight or flight stance. You can fly off and not do anything, or you can stay and fight. And I think that's what we should be encouraging. There's no good moaning about it. It's what's going to happen. So, okay, what am I going to do about it? And to me, there's two. You want to go in and go, oh, well, I want to play against this guy every day, and I'm going to play him as hard as I can, and I'm going to become better. And eventually, that's what's going to happen. And I go back to my rookie year. I never got on the court, but every day at practice, I made sure it was my best day. And I tell the rookie players that come in, like Uwazawa, every practice has to be like a game to you. Every time you've got to go at this guy, and Take. I think Take's really grown, and I've said to him, you're going to guard, I think, the smartest point guard in the game in Japan every day at practice. Mate, go after it. Make life tough for him, and you'll only get better, and he has. And, that's the attitude that they've got to take against that. It's not fair, but neither's life.
All right. Well, Australia went through that, and now they're now a powerhouse in the world. So,
yeah.
So why do you think Japan has become such an attractive destination for Australians to come?
More opportunities. Australia only has 10 teams, and particularly for coaching. So there's only 10 jobs, of which now I think, let me work it out. 1, no, he's really Australian. 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of the 10 jobs, 6 of the 10 jobs are held by foreigners. So there's not a lot of job opportunities, and I think that's a big reason. For the players, I think the financial side of it's better in Japan. The living is better. I shouldn't say that, but the living is really good. It's not necessarily better, it's different. But it's really good. You know, it's a safe country. You know, when you see, 8, 7, 8, 9-year-olds walking down the street home from their classes at 7 o'clock at night, you would never see that back home.
Yeah, every import says that.
Ever would you see that, and I think that side of it is really good. And so why wouldn't you want to come here and maximise yourself as a player? Why wouldn't you want to come here and get more coaching experience where you can do it full time? Because unless you're in the NBL in Australia, you can't be a full-time coach.
Right.
And as I said, there's only 10 head coaching jobs, which 6 are held by foreign coaches. And then, the assistant coaches jobs, some of them aren't very high paying. And, again, there's not that many of them. So, and I think it's a fun place to come because, we've got plenty of knowledge to share. And if you can come and help share that knowledge and make somebody better, then that's the best part of being a coach.
So if some Australian coach or player came up to you and kind of asked you about the B League, what would you tell them about?
I would talk to them about how much it's grown. The level of import from when I arrived to now is so much better. We're getting so many more imports in the prime of their careers in Japan. I would talk to them about that it's an amazingly well-scouted league. I think the Japanese coaches are the best video analysis that I've ever worked with personally. They do an amazing job. You have no secrets in Japan. The guys, just because they're I guess it's part of growing up in the education system. They're very, very studious and astute in the way they approach that side of the game. So you certainly go into every game very well prepared and with information. I would tell them about that. I would tell them the biggest thing you can help them do is start to show more initiative. Be able to make better decisions under pressure in regards to the chaos that it becomes. And my father-in-law, who's done some work at a very high level in the military and also the police, said, you can have the best laid plans in the world, but the moment in war the first bullet's fired, it all goes to chaos. So how you now respond in that chaotic moment is going to be what ends up happening. And to me, it's one of the reasons why the imports tend to dominate the game still. And there's only a handful of Japanese players that can, we obviously have Saito, who's very, very good at that. So bringing in things to teach decision-making and initiative and understanding that, it's not a rote system. It's not A, B, C, D, E. It could be A, E, D, B, C. That's how the game works. It's not a perfect world. So what do you do when it's not perfect? How do you solve that problem? And that's the weakness of Japan basketball, but it's improving dramatically. As I said, you look at what Tom Hovas did with the women and the way that they were able to just overcome so much because they learnt that organised chaos is how it's meant to be. And they excelled in it. And they had a couple of players who just blossomed in that. And I think the men, you look at Yuki Kawamura, once he really grasped that side of it, what a player he's become, exceptional. And I think that, more and more players are getting better at those things. And that's the growth that any players coming in or any coaches coming in can continue to help the players learn to compete. I've always said, I watch the players practice and they love 1-on-0 drills. And I watch them in the off season. All they do is 1-on-0, 1-on-0, 1-on-0. You know, there's no defense. So I'm like, well, so how do you know when that shot's available and when it's not? You should be playing 1-on-1 and playing pickup, you know, because that's what everyone else does around the world. That's how you get better. You just go and play with your mates, and you hoop and you try things and you learn, and you know. But there seems to be this thing in Japan that, but you might get injured. Well, mate, I've got more chance of being injured by a bike coming under the railway tracks here on the wrong side of the road than getting injured by just playing pickup with my mates. You know, and and we've really tried to encourage that. In the last 2 years, we've had some open gym sessions where we've had players come from Mikawa, FE, and the boys just play, and you can see them, they love it. And I want to try and encourage that more and more and more. And I think, you know, a great thing that I'd love to see in Japan is I think Japan's got enough players to almost have its own summer league, you know, and let the players come in and play, and you know whether. But there's some teams who still wouldn't let their guys do that, and I think it's crazy. It's crazy, you know. When I feel like saying, do you know every American that you recruit is back home playing pickup all summer? Right. How do you think he's in shape when he gets here? You know, it's the only way you learn to play the game. Play it,
right.
And play it with no coaches, where no one's going to critique you if you make a mistake, other than yourself, or maybe a teammate might. Hey, we want to win this, and it's a way to build competitive spirit. You know, and you can grow confidence in your decision making in those moments, and that's the area to me that needs to really grow in Japanese basketball.
Yeah, I interviewed Nick Kay a few weeks back. Yeah. He was saying the same thing. He's always playing basketball, even during the summer. Yeah. And I asked him about that, and he was like, it's just easier to stay in shape than trying to get into shape.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, and it is. I mean, I'd much rather play a game of pickup, you know, 4-on-4, 5-on-5, full court, than run sprints, you know, and all that. You know, gosh, truth. It's much more fun.
Yeah. Before I wrap this up, what's something you want the Dolphins fan to understand about this team this year that maybe doesn't always show up in like a box score or like during the game?
That's a great question. Because I think a lot of it does show up. Nothing comes to mind. I mean, you know,
we have this feeling that it's a very special team.
Yeah, sure, I do. You know, and you know, it is. I mean, for me, you know, I said to the group, I'm getting the feeling that I had when I was with the Brecs in my first year and we won the championship. Around the same time, we've been through some different adversities and trying to work things out along the way. And it was around the same time, around April, that we got this feeling at the Brecs, and you could feel like, you know, we could do something pretty special this year. You know, I think we've got a real shot at this. And I think this group has. Again, as long as we don't get ahead of ourselves, you know, and become complacent, I think this group has a real shot. I think we defend the right way, you know, and I think the offense is growing in confidence. And I'm going to say to our fans, I guess one thing, I think we're a better shooting team than we show.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, there's worries about that, but my feeling is I think by the CS, the shooting is going to be solid, and it's been improving, and the confidence is improving, and I think that's perhaps one thing we don't show enough, that I think we are a better shooting team than we show.
And finally, could you give us a message directly to the Dolphins fans?
To our fans, you know, I mean, there's nothing like coming out into that stadium when it's full and the fans are cheering and listening to them support our team with such passion. It gives you goosebumps, you know, and being able to talk to the thing that's amazed me about our fans is how many stay behind to listen to me speak, and then whoever gets the MVP or the On Fire award, and the support they show. You know, we just want to repay that support with going as far as we can this year, and we're going to continue to fight to do that.
All right, Coach. Thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
It's been great to hear from you. I think everybody got a bigger picture of basketball now. Hopefully you get some listeners from down under.
That'd be good.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good luck for the rest of the season.
Cheers.